I would say since Trump's election, even before, the chorus of articles in places like the Financial Times, the Wall Street Journal, and so on, talking about the really great performance of the American economy is amazing to me. 2.8%, maybe. That's the best of the various estimates. There are many quite lower. But 2.8%, the United States GDP grew in 2024, the year just ended. That's according to the IMF, which is a pro-Western institution. That's their number. They're as good or better than anybody else who does this kind of number. The same IMF says that this year, in 2024, the growth in China, 5%, double. In India, 7%, triple. India and China are the two central players in something called the BRICS. The gap between the BRICS and the G7, that's the American equivalent, is therefore growing, as it has every one of the last 25 years. You're not in great shape if that gap is growing. You're not. Or at least, let's put it this way. It's very odd to talk about what a great shape you are and leave discussion of this out. Because from this angle, it ain't so great. But we live in a country where it was necessary. I want to remind you, I'm sure you noticed, but the whole last 2 years of the Biden administration, the following phenomena really irritated people. The economy, all the economics people were doing great. But poll after poll of the American people said the economy is the number one problem we have. So there was article after article which went like this. Why are the American people misunderstanding the reality of the economy? And there were lots of advice to the Democrats. Be careful, you're going to get hurt in the election. You've got to make people understand just the idea that the economists might be looking at the wrong thing and the mass of people looking at something else, and that would explain why they had a different, could not raise the most obvious. What? You had to make one side or the other stupid. So the mass of the people are ill-informed, inadequately. What are you doing? You have the greatest control over mass media of any society, and you have for a long time. If the masses don't get it, what's the matter with your system? You've gotten them to believe everything else you need. You can't get this. They couldn't break out of it. And it did hurt them in the election. But I'm here to tell you that the American economy is in terribly difficult conditions. And now the anxiety that he's provoking this, particularly with I'm cutting back. I have a good friend, a woman who works in a shelter in New York City. Several hundred people live in this shelter. And they were going to close this coming August. She explained to me yesterday it has been moved up till March because the government money is drying up. And then they had a scare last week when he issued that order because some official in Washington told them they might have to close this next week, dumping several hundred people onto the streets of New York City so they can join the others sleeping in the subway tunnels of New York City. And also, since a number of these people have fairly serious emotional or mental problems, my wife will not go on the subway anymore. She's afraid. She's afraid of random physical violence, which particularly affects women. This is a person who's not even about to steal, who just comes up and bashes you in the head with a brick or something because you remind them of their mother or their cousin or some bad moment in their lives or something. You know, it's just... So I could give you endless statistics, but it's an economy in a lot of trouble. And here again, the notion of irrelevance. It's not that what he does has no impact. It does. But there's no link between a concerted, strategic approach to a clearly defined logical target. That's why the naughty and the theatrics seem to be mostly what this is about. Poking liberals in the eye, being offensive in your language, being dramatic. I'm taking the canal, I want Greenland, screw NATO, screw Denmark, all of this. What's it for? It's not going to help the situation with any of those countries. Denmark, Europeans, I can assure you, are up in arms that for them, they never heard of this. A member of NATO is basically taking the property of another member of NATO. The whole point of NATO was not to have this. They used to tell each other how they have to love each other and take care of each other because of the big Russian bear that's bearing down on them. This is the end of Europe as a major player in the world economy. And that has not happened for centuries. And people not to understand that is going to be a traumatic feature of our lives in the years ahead are not understanding what's going on. The turmoil inside these countries, the loss of the war in Ukraine, the end of NATO, all of these things are happening. And meanwhile, Europe has no role in the innovative economy of the future. It's all the United States and above all, China. And DeepSeek happens in China. It doesn't happen in Germany or England. And those economies, Germany is in recession now. Its GDP is negative, it's shrinking. It used to be the engine of Europe. In German, it's called Wirtschaftswunder. It's the economic miracle. Germany coming back, losing the 2 world wars, and now it's a basket case. It can't function. And the irony, it's their Americanism that killed them. When the United States decided to have this war in Ukraine, to set Zelensky up to fight the Russians with American money and American weapons, they demanded the fealty of the Europeans to provide money and to provide weapons, which they did. Since the military prospects weren't so good, they waged a sanctions war against Russia, the most important part of which was Europe's refusal to continue to buy cheap oil and gas from Russia, which is the world's second greatest source of cheap oil and gas. And to make the point clear, remember, they cut the underwater pipeline. So, who's the biggest user of cheap oil and gas? Germany. Turns out the Wirtschaftswunder was because you had cheap energy, which nobody else could compete with because the Russians provided it at dirt cheap prices. So they refused. They had to turn then for their energy to the world market, including the United States, which now ships huge quantities of liquefied natural gas to the Europeans at a much higher price. The Germans can't compete. The German industry is leaving Germany. For the first time in 60 years, the number one company in Germany, Volkswagen, is closing factories and laying off thousands of workers and therefore having enormous conflict with the powerful union. What's going on here? Is it possible, the whole world asks, that the Americans and the Europeans couldn't see that when you punish Russia with sanctions that stop you from buying oil and gas, that they will find someone else to sell it to? And maybe the BRICS that they're part of would have the Chinese and the Indians buy the oil and gas, which is what happened. That they didn't see it? Is the level of denial and delusion so deep that we're going to see one horrific miscalculation like this after another? Everywhere in Europe, It is understood that the war in Ukraine is being lost, except here.